Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/Bliss and Grit. Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Brooke Thomas, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Vanessa Scotto. On the show, we're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path and what does that even mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything, the beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life? Today, we're deepening the conversation from our last two episodes, so our episode on Awakened Relating with Lynn Marie Lumiere, and then last week's episode on the how of self-love. And we're doing that by really honing in on how we find safety in the world and in our relationships, whether those are relationships with intimate partners or our children, our friends, our coworkers, any kind of relationship, really. And in particular, we're using the lens of Stephen Porges' Polyvagal theory to look more closely at what happens when we don't detect safety and the magical things, yes, I said magical things, that can happen when our nervous systems do detect safety and therefore don't have to be defensive. We ponder what even is defensive behavior beyond the caricatures that we typically think of. What are the cultural stories that keep us from experiences of safety? And how do we get out of the you're a problem or I'm a problem binary loop? And how healing really begins to happen and how healing even takes care of itself the more that we can self-regulate and co-regulate and find safety in our environments. If you're enjoying the show, there are a few ways you can help support us. We would love it if you would leave a review. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe to receive our weekly digest, or find out more about becoming one of our supporting members on Patreon. Becoming a patron is the way to help us keep these episodes rolling, so if you've been benefiting from the show and wanting to support us, we would really appreciate it if you went over to Patreon and made a donation. We both also see clients privately, so feel free to go to the website to find our private practice links there. The last thing is that we do occasionally curse, so you may want headphones or just to be aware of the company you're keeping when you listen. Okay. Here we go.
Hello, dear Brooke.
Hello, Vanessa.
So, we're going to talk today about intimacy and the nervous system. Pretty exciting stuff, right?
It is very, very jazzy stuff, yes.
Yes, always fascinating to see where we'll go. And we're going to talk about all sorts of things. We're going to bring in Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory. We may sprinkle in some attachment theory. Just to say up front, it's not that we're experts in all of this, but we have a pretty good working understanding of it all. So it'll be a really good place for you to get your brains running on it, get your juices stirred, and then you could always go and look it up on your own to get some of the more detailed information. But a couple weeks back, maybe you all heard the interview, we interviewed Lynn Marie Lumiere. The topic was Awakened Relating. And in her book and in the interview, Lynn Marie had shared like a sprinkling of quotes about how you have to experience safety in the nervous system in relationship, and how sometimes under the radar of your conscious mind, your nervous system may still react to people and to triggers that are based on your childhood conditioning. She even mentioned at one point how safety is formed in two nervous systems relating earlier in life, and how even if we're awakened, consciousness doesn't need anything, but the tissues of the human body need connection. And this was all pretty powerful. You and I obviously really liked it. And when I shared it on Instagram, I heard a lot from you guys, both relating to the quote and asking if we could speak a little more about this, about finding safety in the nervous system when we have earlier relational traumas, which most of our traumas are relational, and we're now in love or in partnership or dating or thinking about being in love and in partnership. So let's see where this goes, right?
Let's see where this goes. Yeah.
Should I start by reading a quote from Porges?
Yeah.
Want to begin
and
that
just
way?
for those listening, this might wind up being a little bit of a quote sprinkling kind of episode, which can be fun, but we have a lot of good ones from Porges.
Yeah, it's just that he says it so specifically, and he's the creator of polyvagal theory, and it really is so helpful to understand this stuff. I mean, when we talk about trauma, they talk about sometimes in psychology, capital T trauma versus little t trauma, capital T being the things that most of us can relate to as being horrific or tragic for a person to go through, things like rape, abuse, physical, sexual, losing your parents early, just capital T type of issues. But there's also something that we have to look at that's called developmental trauma. And developmental trauma is when we didn't get the right cues of safety early in our life, or our needs were neglected, or we were objectified, right? So developmental trauma, I think it's fair to say most of us have.
Yeah, it's pretty universal in our culture.
It's pretty universal. And even in the field of psychology, we talk about good enough mothering. They put that in quotes, good enough mothering. And that's just to bring home that you don't have to be a perfect parent in order to have your child feel, safe and a sense of worth. And that's true. And yet, if we're curious about the awakening path, we start to get curious about all the layers of conditioning that may inhibit us from being fully present, fully connected and receptive in the moment. And when we start to look at that, we can see all the ways interpersonal relationships have created some sense of either unsafety or a misunderstanding about ourselves, life, or others. So I think, coming from that perspective, we could look at this as trauma creates unsafety, because we're going to talk a lot about safety today in the episode. But you can just also understand that these types of developmental traumas can be considered unsafe by the nervous system that on a very basic level is looking for a certain kind of attunement and care. Mm-hmm. Okay, so with that, we're going to read a little bit from Stephen Porges, and I'm going to just start with this beautiful quote about safety and why safety is important. And then we're going to weave that into why we want safety in our relationships and what happens when safety goes off the rails and we start to feel that we're unsafe. So he goes, if our nervous system detects safety, then it's no longer defensive. When it's no longer defensive, then the circuits of the autonomic nervous system support health, growth, and restoration. Now, let me just pause there. If our nervous systems detect safety, then it's no longer defensive. So if we think about that, and then we start to flesh out what does it mean to be defensive, right? So, i.e., how can I tell if I feel safe? If I have defensive behavior or thoughts, then my body is physiologically not in a state of safety. So if we start to look at defensiveness, well, you could look at anxious thinking. You could look at shallow breathing. You could look at either I'm a problem or they're a problem. You could look at judgment, shame, blame, and then, of course, guardedness, withholding. All of those things can be put under defensiveness. And if you consider that, it gets really interesting to see, geez, how often do I feel safe with people?
Yeah. And how much of that describes just what most of us think relationships are. And certainly it's what's presented to us as what relationships are in like TV, movies, books, right? Like relationships are struggling to figure out what the compromise will, blaming and big explosive fight, and then making up and then not feeling safe again. And so it's really like this whole context of what we think relationship even is actually just nervous system defensiveness.
And then, if you watch like a sitcom, for example, they'll have all of this nervous system activation, but then it's followed by some really beautiful repair. Right. Where they like find safety again. And that's lovely. But maybe if we're lucky, we could short circuit some of the pattern of defensiveness. But one of the things our guest Lynn Marie had pointed out was that her experience as a couples therapist is that we do become magnets for those people who will help us see our wounding and our belief system and our triggers ever so clearly. So the other thing that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention, just as we're, kind of slowly going through this, is the second part of the quote where he says, when it's no longer defensive, then the circuits of the autonomic nervous system support health, growth, and restoration. And this is something that both of us have seen in our own lives. Maybe you've seen it in the same way. But there's something really interesting about acknowledging that if our body can't establish a sense of safety, we can't quite evolve and grow.
Yeah. And conversely, when we can, like when we are able to, and you and I will talk more specifically about what it means to do this, but when we're able to self-regulate, when we're able to contact safety in the environment and really let it in, then actually things take care of themselves even more. It's not a matter of struggling to negotiate or to get your needs met. It's like in some ways the whole game, to use a weird word, is self-regulation and co-regulation. And then things kind of take care of themselves, which isn't to say, because the way the ego is going to picture what I just described is like two boring people sitting on a couch staring off into nirvana together. It doesn't mean like this kind of constant plateau. It means the ability to just enjoy and appreciate the basics of life together.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you said, then healing really begins to happen when we talk in, let's say, spiritual teachings about things like surrender and synchronicity and life will lead you and trust life and that all you have to do is open yourself up to receive the messages. It's important to understand that when your body is physiologically hijacked into unsafety, you are not going to experience any of that in a real, genuine way. And it's going to be an effort like, I got to make myself surrender, which is creating higher levels of stress. When you find safety, it seems as if we almost naturally can move that way, right? That our intention, once put in the direction of healing, is very beautifully met by something. Something rises up to meet it and things unfold. The way Porges put it is he says, when we're safe, magical things occur. They occur on multiple levels, not merely in terms of social relations, but also in accessibility of certain areas of the brain, certain areas of feeling pleasure, being expansive, being creative, and being very positive as well. Mm-hmm. So, if you imagine relationship in this very big way, let's talk about it in the largest way. We could talk about it in terms of friendship, family, lovers, therapists, massage therapists, coaches. We can talk about it in this really big way. If we can't establish a sense of safety, it's hard for us to really work on something and see the evolution. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a place where a lot of us can then wind up feeling really stuck, really frustrated. It's quite painful because it feels like we're applying ourselves. We're trying to show up for this relationship, or we're going to therapy. We're listening to the therapist. We're doing the exercises. I listened to Matt Kahn. He said, put my hands on my heart. We're doing all of these things, and yet we're not seeing or experiencing this evolution where we're open and expansive and trusting, and where we can see firsthand, my thoughts have changed, my feelings have changed, my awareness has changed, because we're not really meant to go through evolutionary processes. Soul evolutionary processes might be considered not the priority when the body's in survival mode. We're not really meant to go through them unless we're already experiencing ourselves as safety, or so it seems.
And this is where you and I get endlessly fascinated, right? Because you said this, but just to be very direct, spiritual teachings are teaching about the perspective that happens from a very balanced nervous system that's able to access safety.
Yeah, once you already
it's
feel
a nervous
safe,
system
here's what's up.
Teaching, well, it's saying like, let's find that state, right? And what is the state? Is the state the magical lightning bolt that comes from the sky? Like, I don't know, maybe for some people, but the state itself is one of a balanced, harmonious, well-integrated, resilient nervous system, and not one that's, like I was saying before, stuck in zombie mode, the caricature of the enlightened one, but one that can really be here and feel safe enough in the world to participate in the world in a way that feels like joy and also contentment and ease and just availability, right? Like you were saying, I just don't think that we realize how much, because it's the container that we're all in, that this is a container of an awful lot of survival states going on most of the time. And so we're starting to have more and more, we've had teachers for a few thousand years, people like Jesus and Buddha who are like demonstrating this state, but we're starting to have more and more people, teachers, but also regular old people you'll encounter in your daily life who have a more balanced nervous system. And you see that the way their lives go, these are people who are just in flow more often, resilient more often. They have long-term healthy relationships, by which I mean with all kinds of people, colleagues, friends, also intimate partners. And that's what this is all pointing to. You and I love the mystical stuff, and we can get as mystical as we want to. And that's also true. That's available as well. But we can keep it really simple and be like, oh, okay, all these amazing innovators like Stephen Porges, like Peter Levine, who are talking about innovative ways to understand healing unresolved trauma in the system, shifting nervous system states. They're teaching the same thing that like the spiritual teachers are trying to get across too. Like there's another way to be in your human life. There's another kind of state to access, which allows you to be much more available to, and I love that he used this word, the magical things. Like it's a magical thing to go through your life where you spend a much higher percentage of your time enjoying the fact that you're cutting vegetables for dinner and then meeting friends for a movie. And it's just a level of enjoyment where things can really enter and permeate. But in the case of our episode today, we're talking about it in terms of relationship, which is where we see it the most clearly, like someone's holding up a very clear mirror about where we're at in our nervous systems. Do we feel safe or not?
Yeah.
And our conditioning.
And the way the conditioning interplays with it. So there's so much we could say, but we'll stay a little bit focused. One thing to add about the spiritual teachings part is that when I think of it, I think teachers aren't only teaching us how to find safety. Sometimes they're speaking from the perspective of safety.
Yeah.
And so the dilemma can be that, well, no, I don't mean as in resonance. I mean like surrender. something you do once you feel safe, naturally. But if you don't feel unsafe, try surrendering.
Right.
So sometimes the spiritual teachings are beautiful, but they're coming from one who already experiences oneness and safety. And what I like about this kind of a focused in teaching that comes from Porges or someone like Peter Levine or, there's plenty of teachers out there like this, is they're actually teaching you how to find safety again. Right? Like more nitty gritty. Mm-hmm. Because if you can't find safety, then it means that your limbic brain or your reptilian brain, but usually your limbic brain is dominating your experience. If that's happening, just like we spoke about, I think it was last week, you're not in that prefrontal cortex. You're not in the part of your body that is available to that expansiveness or that magic and synchronicity and beauty. And so then when you get a teaching, oftentimes you're not accessing it. You're not actually experiencing it. You're only getting the intellectual understanding of it. So I like that now into spiritual circles, we can bring these conversations of, okay, a lot of us were really hurt in relationship, and we have a lot of conditioning, and we have a lot of nervous system activation or dysregulation that can happen as a result of it. And there is a way to heal that. And as that's healed, then as we keep awakening and opening more to oneness and the truth of our nature and the truth of reality, hopefully we're going to not only be wonderful, evolved beacons of light, but healthy in relationship, which we see there are plenty of teachers where that's not the case.
For sure. Yeah.
Right.
And
so huge for us.
I'd like to maybe back up a little bit to, I'm going to use another Porges quote as well, but to something that's so important and also rare to allow this kind of healing to take place. So I'm going to read one of his quotes. So that we can play with a little bit like, okay, what are some of the necessary ingredients? Because I can imagine that most of us listening and you and I talking like, okay, that's what I want. I want to be able to access more safety so that I can have more receptivity and flow. Yes, please. I would like some of that. This is the Porges quote. The first thing is to convey to the client that they did not do anything wrong. As soon as we ask a client to change, the client often interprets this to mean that they did something wrong. Once this critical feedback is processed by the nervous system might switch into a state of defense, which will make it more difficult for the client to understand and maintain a calm state. So there's a total paradox between how our nervous system functions and how we raise our children, teach our students, and treat our clients. So this is, to me, this is so amazing. And I see this so much because I work in the wellness industry, but it's because it's a function of our entire culture, which is, what are you doing wrong? How do you fix it so that you can finally be the good, acceptable human being? Or who are the bad guys out there? What are they doing wrong? Go get them, fix them. So there's all this wrongness. And because it's what we just, swim in, then we can't really, we have to give ourselves a little distance from it with things like this show. And it moves so fast because this is cultural conditioning. Cultural conditioning is even more embedded than, let's say, familiar conditioning. Let's say you have a family where you had parents who were extremely neglectful. But then you go to college and you meet all these people whose parents are there helping them set up their futon and bringing them snacks and sending them letters. And you can have this moment, right, of like, oh, there's this other thing. There's this other way of parenting. But if there's a cultural story, it's bigger because it's among the many. And if it's among the many, it's much harder to have that bubble pop of like, oh, there's other ways to be. So the other way to be would be things more like unconditional, kind regard, a kind of faith in people. And I love that he points out, this is our nervous system functions very differently from the way that we around these parts raise our children, teach our students, treat our clients. And, as a parent, I could see this in the school environment for sure, that there's a belief that if you shame a child, they will do better. They'll produce more. They'll produce better grades. They'll clean up their act or whatever it is. It's really wild. And then, of course, that's a part of parenting culture. For sure, that's the way that I was parented. So I get to watch how I would start to move towards my son in maybe, and I can feel him detect not safe and shut down. And now there's no conversation to be had at all, because an unsafe person isn't going to be receptive to anything you're going to say. So it's like this complete dismantling of what we see all the time. And I see it in clients absolutely, right? That the number one thing, and it's so simple that the mind, which loves complexity and problems to tackle, and, I can lean in, I can do hard things. It misses that there's this really, really, really simple, absolutely fundamental ingredient, which is indicating to, in this case, the other, that they are welcomed as they are, that they are not, that even though you're engaged, let's say in the case of talking with a client in therapeutic work, even though you're engaged in a conversation about transformation, and both of you are there because that's what you do, one of you helps, the other is there because they want transformation, that there still has to be you are welcomed exactly as you are. And we're here for transformation, but not because you did something wrong, not because there's something bad that needs to be buffed out of you, not because there's a bucket of badness that one day maybe you'll get to the bottom of and then you'll be worthy. So it's so counterculture and it's so easy to miss that I just want to bring that to the foreground, because I read that quote and I was like, oh my God, that is like in a short paragraph form, the calling of my life. With Rolfing clients and with coaching clients, it's constantly inviting back to the party, like, you're not damaged goods. That's not what's happening here. Mm-hmm. And in parenting, absolutely for sure too.
Well, if we can slow down what you said about your son, for example, that if you're approaching him in a certain way and he doesn't read cues of safety, he shuts down. What occurred to me when you were saying that is what happens to someone when they shut down. Well, they could look dissociated, they could not speak, they could get agitated, right? All sorts of physiological things can happen. But what happens on a more psychological level, let's put it, or perhaps on a more coding of the brain level, is shutdown means binary, dualistic. When we're in our limbic brain, which is what shutdown means, we go into the brain that's in charge of regulating relationship and safety and relationship. So we go into the limbic brain. The limbic brain thinks very dualistically. It does shame, blame, and judgment. That's its game, and there's always a problem to solve. So the moment when we're approaching someone and they're not perceiving cues of safety, then they go into either you're a problem or they're a problem. Mm-hmm. That's what shutdown means. So they go into a state of defensiveness that either gets turned outward to the person or it gets turned inward to shame. I've done something bad. I've done something wrong. So if you think about a kid, for example, and you're approaching them like that, oftentimes you're just trying to teach your kid something, right? Like, it's not safe for you to do this, or, that hurt someone's feelings. And you're hoping that they're going to get this beautiful life lesson that they can evolve and be their best shiny self. But if they don't feel safe, they'll instead make it into a binary belief and collapse into I'm ashamed, or collapse into my parents horrible, like you're the worst, whatever it is. So then if we think about that in terms of intimacy and partnership, it gets really interesting, because with couples therapy, and I didn't ever really practice couples therapy a lot. I did a little bit while I was in school. But I have friends who that's their primary specialty. The thing that people always talk about with couples therapy is the first session, two people often come in waiting for the therapist to tell them that they're right and help them fix their broken partner. Mm-hmm. Well, that whole energy of you're really screwed up. If you could just hear me and do things the right way, which is so common, often winds up evoking a defensive response from the person. And the way we perceive it when we're the ones in that role is like, I'm just telling them what's bothering me, and I'm offering them a way to stop bothering me, right? Stop hurting me so we can, be in a healthy, happy relationship. But often, because we're perfect triggers for each other, lock and key, what's being experienced is we're really triggered. So when we share that information, we're not exhibiting cues of safety. Cues of safety are soft eyes, a sweet melodic voice that goes up and down and primarily stays in higher frequencies, higher pitches. A smile on our face, soft facial muscles with a smile. We're not exhibiting that because we're triggered. So we're telling someone in our triggered state how they really messed up and hurt us. And then we want them to be open and receptive and kind to us about how they really screwed up. But if their trigger is lock and key with ours, they just go into their defensive mode. And then they don't trigger cues of safety for us. And then we can see how complex this gets, which is why often it can take that third party, like a couples therapist, to help us see through the patterning and find a new way to negotiate safety again. But that's what we're talking about here, because it's kind of sad and innocent, right? Like we're just doing what we were taught. We don't feel safe. We can't experience ourselves as being loved and met, or someone hurt us with what they did or said. And we feel we're just trying to communicate it. But once you understand this, you can understand, like, this is easier said than done sometimes. Like, I've had boyfriends who were, most of my ex-boyfriends, one of them being 6'5", who big guy, strong guy. And he would say that when I was upset, I was scary.
I know exactly who you're talking about.
Yes, right? Can you imagine? Like,
yeah, I know. It's so funny.
And there were multiple people. I think it was the third time I heard a guy say that to me that I was like, okay, obviously I'm scary. And that doesn't matter that inside I'm just feeling scared and dysregulated. I took that as interesting information. And then, of course, what were they saying? There's no cues of safety with me because I was so triggered. I was in such a state of alarm that I wasn't giving them any cues of safety. And then they were going into their defense mode.
I was re-listening to our conversation with Lynn. This is related to what you're talking about here, all right, let me zoom back. The missing piece that we're talking about, which never gets invited to the party culturally, is that self-regulation is a thing and it's a skill we can learn and it changes our lives. Like, it would be amazing if that were taught in school. If we just started self-regulation class in kindergarten and went all the way through the end of high school. Not because it's so hard, but because it's valuable. It's not hard, but it's valuable. And we could bring it to the forefront of contemporary humans' lives. And if we all get really skillful with reading our own cues of safety or lack of cues of safety and go, I need to regulate. And there is actually somebody who's teaching self-regulation in schools. And of course, I can't remember his name right now, but I will look it up and put it in the show notes because the work's pretty interesting and trying to spread that specifically through school systems. It completely changes the game. And what I was going to say is that Lynn Marie, when she was in the beginning of our conversation with her, she's talking about how when we stay in our egos, even if we're in what we would consider a conscious relationship, there's still this push-pull, right? There's still this triggered state of, give me what I want. Why won't you give me what I want? You feel scary. Stop being scary. Like, there's always this kind of, meet my needs demand underneath it all, even in a highly conscious relationship. Now, one of the things that really can change this for all of us who have any kind of relationship is to know that self-regulation is a learned skill, then suddenly we are in a more awakened relationship state, like Lynn Marie was pointing to, because we realize that there is something other than, let's say, the ego, the one that doesn't want to feel scared in a fight, which of course, like nobody wants to feel scared in a fight. Instead, it becomes the one who is aware that they are not feeling cues of safety in the environment. The one who is aware that they are in a heightened, activated state of their nervous system and cannot find safety because they cannot self-regulate. That's like the time out moment for the self of like, time out, too much input.
Right.
I
and
can't
it means
regulate.
You can't find clarity.
Yeah.
If you can't find safety, you can't find clarity. So nothing you're thinking can be seen to be true with a capital T.
Yeah.
So you're better off taking that time out, you're saying.
Right. And no matter what words you each would use with one another in this conflict, if you can't find safety and you can't find clarity, it's just going to be an exhausting kind of knockdown, drag out situation where nothing actually gets resolved. Maybe at a certain point you get tired enough that or you contract so much that you retreat into really, crusty nervous system states, maybe of like total shutdown or total defensiveness. But we need to make this primary in our conversation about being people in the world, that self-regulation is a learned skill and we can access it and we can know that, first of all, we have the ability and a right to feel safe, for starters. And that if we're not able to detect cues of safety, it's like either time out for self-regulation, that as well. And then also like once you can get a little space, a little self-regulation, then you can be a little discerning, right? Like, well, do I always feel attacked by my partner? Or is there something going on here where I just literally don't know how to be receptive at all in intimate partnership? It could be a million different things, but without the distance, nothing ever shifts or changes.
What I think is interesting to add to what you're saying is, remember how when we interviewed Neelam on the awakening nervous system, she was talking about the capacity of the nervous system and how that's predetermined. We don't get to choose what the capacity of our nervous system would be. So one of the things I notice happen in couples is, let's say one of them has an avoidant attachment style. Now, believe it or not, no one chose their attachment style.
Right.
So people didn't say, oh, I choose avoidant because that's cooler and easier and like more powerful. If someone's attachment style is avoidant, it means they really have a hard time trusting other people and feeling safe with other people. And so let's say, for example, you have two people together and one has an anxious, even if it's close to secure attachment style, and one has an avoidant attachment style. When you look at the research from Gottman, his name is Gottman, Gottman, one of the, like a really big researcher on couples therapy, he would talk about that when someone is shut down, withdrawing, or what we could call stonewalling, we may have heard that term, it's really the avoidant person that tends to do this, that when they measured their physiological markers, like their pulse rate and everything, this person who looks completely shut down on the outside, completely cold even sometimes, if you've been on the other side of stonewalling, they can feel totally inaccessible and super cold, which can be really scary to an anxious person. But when you're on the other side, they look like they're like kind of calm and detached. But when they measured their physiological markers, they're in a complete state of panic. Mm-hmm. And so what's happened is their capacity, which they don't get to determine, has reached its limit. And because they have this avoidant attachment style, which means this lack of trust in people, their safety with others, they tend to feel more safe on their own, they go into this withdrawal. It's the only way they can get the space to make them feel safe. Now, some of what I hear then is the person on the other side being like, but why can't they just give me?
Right.
And it can feel like a repetitive trauma because, put money on it, someone in their early childhood wasn't able to give them the nurturance and validation and mirroring and support that they needed. So it starts to feel as if someone is willfully withholding on you and potentially hurting you. Now, of course, couples can learn skills to help them navigate this. Like what you described about the timeout, Brooke, if you were, to work with a therapist who specializes in couples, especially people who've studied Gottman's work and others like that, they're very big on the timeout. And you say, I need an hour. And then I'll come back and talk to you so that the anxious person can stay really calm. And an avoidant person can learn to exhibit cues of safety, to realize they're shutting down, and they can take deep breaths and they can soften their eyes and soften their mouth and they can speak differently. And the anxious person can learn to take deep breaths and not crowd the space or self-regulate. So, of course, everything we're saying, there's plenty of hope. But I think it's really useful to recognize in relationship, whoever you're in relationship with, kids, spouses, parents, coworkers, that if they're moving into a dysregulated nervous system, their survival system in a more extreme way, it's not personal. It is that they have reached their capacity to tolerate whatever emotion is arising, and they no longer feel safe, and they're moving into what they know how to do. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the anxious person who's coming after you, the angry person, the avoidant person. Again, this doesn't mean we accept disrespect. There's no justification. This doesn't mean we accept abuse. But I think it's important to recognize capacity so that we can have greater understanding and compassion, and also less possibility of triggering our earlier childhood narratives where somebody, where we paint the picture that somehow we weren't good enough to receive the love, or we weren't important enough, or things like that.
Yeah, it's more empathetic to both self and other.
To both self and other.
Towards the other, you can see it's just the way that they learned how to survive states that feel like this. And towards the self, it's not because they are, willfully withholding love from me or trying to make me insane, and my caveat, and having been in a relationship with a sociopath, every once in a blue moon, you do meet one of those characters, and then you leave. But same thing, right? Like if we, even in a scenario like that, the better we get at self-regulating, the better we get at detecting cues of safety and really knowing. I mean, for many of us, we need to repair to the degree, not because we're so broken, but just we haven't had a lot of experience of what does safety even feel like. Once we get to know what that actually feels like, then we can put our compass in that direction more and more. And then the more we put our compass in that direction, then we can actually make really good discerning decisions about our partnership. Is my partner willing and able to also learn about their own self-regulation? And I don't mean it in a let's both study and read all the books, but just in an ability to notice I am at capacity. Nothing useful is going to come out of a conversation in this state. Or do you have a partner who it doesn't matter how many cues of safety you give them, they cannot receive the safety, not because they're bad people, but because they literally don't know how to see, perceive, receive any of the cues. It does not matter how many cues of safety you give them. There's just, that can't happen either. So it all points towards, it's just like win, 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 win all over the place, right? Like it's more loving towards the other. It's more loving towards the self. And the outcome is always going to be more clear decision making about how is this how's this partnership really going for me?
Yeah. Am I actually happy? Am I actually safe? Yeah.
Yeah. Because there's 7 billion people on the planet, right? Like,
I know, but that clarity. And I think if you can't find that state of safety, which helps you access clarity because you're actually present, you're not running all the scripts from the past. So you can see things with a much, much more broad, open view, then it's hard to make a decision in either direction because you kind of know somewhere you're not sure, right? Because you know deep down, like, I'm not able to access my sense of clarity. So we can feel almost like 1 foot in, 1 foot out all of the time. Mm-hmm. And what you said before about there's some people that can't feel cues of safety, you know, and we could be those people. If we're in a really dysregulated state, we cannot see cues of safety anywhere, no matter how people are giving them. And that's just an important thing to remember, because what's difficult is on a very tissue level, on a very primal level, we look for cues of safety to reestablish the social engagement system, which is the parasympathetic system that we think of, the rest and restoration system. It's the ventral vagal. We look for cues of safety. And if we're so dysregulated that we can't even see them, what I noticed is in a traumatized nervous system, it's not like it's neutral. If we don't see a cue of safety, it's just danger. Mm-hmm. And then we find ourselves feeling uncomfortable in so many situations, in groups of people, you know, just dating. Forget relationships, but what about going on dates, you know, and all of those types of things. And so that's why sometimes it's kind of a callback to last week's episode. When people have been deprived these cues of safety and contact and connection, they want it from the environment, right? Of course they do. We desperately desire connection, and that's so normal and right. But if you can't read cues of safety because you're that dysregulated, there's no amount of someone giving you them that will help you adapt, at least not in ordinary people, maybe a practitioner, right? Someone who's really, really understands this. So that's why that self-regulation piece, or as we talked about in last week's episode, learning to meet ourselves with love to reestablish safety is so important, because if we can even get some traction, some heart coherence, some breath, some amount of safety reestablished, then we might look at our partner, and when they say, "Oh, honey, I love you, everything's okay," our body is capable of actually now taking that in and receiving it and then being soothed.
Mm-hmm. And I think we can all look in our relationship paths and know that there were moments when we couldn't receive those very, very straightforward cues that were there. And that's something that comes with a part of these practices. And that's a part of the magical things that we talked about in the beginning of the episode, that we can receive the nourishment that really is here, if that is what is happening, and that we can discern and leave if there's harm, right? In that kind of egregious way, right? I don't mean just that people get triggered and normal human stuff.
Well, you know, let's go back to something that you were saying earlier in the episode that I just forgot immediately upon saying that.
I was so excited. I was like, oh, she remembers something. Okay, good.
I'm back. Talking about safety really dysregulated my nervous system. No, is when we talk about our culture being in so dominant in states of fight, flight, and freeze. So freeze, if you don't know, think about things like dissociation. So it's so common that I really don't think that we identify ourselves as people who don't feel safe all of the time so easily.
Exactly.
So in the most exaggerated situations, when we're really dysregulated, we may identify like, my gosh, I don't feel safe anywhere. I don't want to leave my house, or I don't want to be around people. But if we look on the average spectrum, when I looked at my first marriage and there was my husband, telling me he loved me or something like that, and I couldn't receive it or feel it, I could only run my narrative of unlovability. I certainly didn't think of myself as someone who had an issue establishing safety, right? I would never have looked at it through that lens. And I think it's such a kind and relieving and, quite frankly, practically useful lens to see it through, is that it's like, okay, well, if you're anxious all the time, that's a cue that your body is not in its safety state. If you're in comparison all of the time, duality, either they're bad or I'm bad all of the time or a lot of the time. If you're in judgment, shame, blame, or self-criticism a lot of the time. Self-criticism, if you've never listened to Kristen Neff talk about self-compassion and you think you're self-critical, she is someone to check out. And when I learned a little bit from Kristen Neff, one of the things she pointed to is that when they did studies on people who were in self-critical states, they were in their survival brains. When we are at rest and at peace and happy and in our highest state where we're connected and expansive and receptive, we're not self-critical. We're not even really thinking about the self awfully much other than like, oh, it would be fun to do this or that, but it's not this kind of dialogue. So even self-criticism is perceived as a threat to the body. It's created by threat, and then it further creates threat, right? That's one of those limbic loops. So if you're in self-criticism, if you think all men are the worst, if you think all women are the worst, if you think relationships are scary, if you have a hard time where as soon as somebody goes inward or takes space or withdraws or doesn't text you back, you're beginning to panic and spiral. These are all signs that your nervous system is not in a state of safety, and it's ridiculously common.
It's our whole cultural model. It's very helpful to know that.
There's secure attachment. So people who are secure, like my blessed miracle of a husband, he's secure. He feels good about himself and he feels good about others. Ta-da.
Yeah, no, he totally does.
In a constant state. And supposedly secure attachment makes up a big bulk of the population. Like, I can't wait to meet more of them.
Bullshit. Yeah, I know. I know your husband. So there's that. Mario's the one person that we can all hold on to. Someone is securely attached.
I know. I exist.
No, but I mean, because I'm obsessed with the cultural piece, it's a great love for me. We all swallowed a story a long time ago called Survival of the Fittest. And we built a culture around that frame. And so when we go to school, it's, are you going to be the top dog or are you going to be the whipping boy? There's all of this narrative about the way it works to be a human organism or an animal on this planet is, you better come out swinging if you expect to survive. It's not the truth. The truth is that things survive and thrive when they are better in relationship, in coherence, the more cooperative they can be. That's the truth. And we're starting to realize like, oh, we could look at it through that lens and see that is true. But when you have a whole cultural frame that built schools, businesses, which means jobs, all around this survival of the fittest narrative, it means we're going to have an awful lot of not safety, because the whole story is it's not safe. Stay in survival mode if you expect to survive. That's very different than like, you're alive. Ta-da! You already exist. You didn't have to do anything to earn it. It seems to keep doing itself without you having to keep it going. And it's just the gift of this life. Ta-da. It's a very different model. And that's the one that we're moving into, I believe, as we're leaving behind survival of the fittest. But honestly, it's one of the reasons why I'm like, really? There's a lot of securely attached people. I know there's good parents out there and everything, but there's this whole cultural frame that says, fight to stay alive, fight to earn your right to exist.
Well, I suppose everything is about relative experience, right? And so perhaps people are relatively in secure attachment. I mean, the whole theory was created based on observing some people that seemed relatively good at this. Mm-hmm. So perhaps even there's still degrees, because we all have our conditioning. Our wounding may not be in love. We might be really secure there, but that doesn't mean we feel safe being out of control, mm-hmm. right? Or, getting up on stage and speaking our mind or articulating difficult beliefs in front of people, right? So even with that, we can still have conditioning that will trigger cues of unsafety or competitiveness, right? Mm-hmm. So that might account for some of that. Let's just read this last quote and see if we can't go into a little bit of support, like what we can offer. But this last quote, I think, is just so juicy and important. The love code has two parts. Phase 1 is social engagement, which uses cues of safety via engagement behaviors to negotiate proximity. Phase 2 deals with physical contact and intimacy. To articulate this as a code would mean that if the two processes do not occur in the right order, there would be problems associated with attachment and bonding. I think from a clinical perspective that people bonding to each other without feeling safe with each other can be one of the driving forces for couples to come to therapy. I'm thinking about this even with my family. So, growing up in a household with somebody, one person with rage and the other person with disguised rage that showed up more as anxiety and emotionality, where they fought a lot. There were like sort of alternating cues of safety and then cues of danger. And it was very unpredictable. Now, the problem is, if there's unpredictability, we never even feel safe with the cues of safety. And if anyone grew up with addiction in their family, that's common. Violence in their family, that's common. It's like, even though sometimes they were really loving people, if they were unpredictable enough times, you don't trust the cues of safety anymore. You start to just listen with hypervigilance for their mood shifting, for the noises changing, right? And instead of looking for safety, you just start to look for signs of threat. So I think that's really interesting because we're often very bonded to our family, but we don't have safety there. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's fascinating, right? It is
fascinating. And then we recreate that, of course.
Yeah, and then it's so fucked up because in order to explain that we feel really connected to these people or bonded to them, but we don't feel safe, we have to start to tell narratives. And sometimes they're, well, I was bad. If I wasn't bad, that wouldn't have happened. Or relationships are horrible. Mom and dad wouldn't have fought otherwise. Like, we have to make up these narratives. But to imagine that with intimacy, I mean, how many times has someone had physical intimacy with someone before you felt safe, but you let them into your physical space? I mean, hello, that was the story of my
everyone's
life
early adulthood.
Yeah, I know. Early adulthood, like, forget that.
What's considered mid-adult? I don't even know.
Yeah, what's considered safe, and then it's really interesting because you're attached to this person, but you guys never develop the glue of I'm really safe to be myself with them. I'm really safe to express myself with them. I'm really safe to let down my guard with them. But we're connected and I don't want to leave them. I mean, what a mind trip. And so I think when he says that's why people often go to couples therapy, it's really lovely to just imagine that something like couples therapy, and you really do need a good couples therapist, but something like couples therapy can be designed to help people learn how to be safe together. Mm-hmm. Because believe me, if one of you doesn't feel safe, unless we have a scenario where someone's an abuser and someone's in that dynamic, but if it's just the two ordinary people in this either shut down or conflictual relationship bouncing back and forth, guess what? Even if you think your partner's to blame, neither of you feel safe. Right? That's the point. Then it's really soft, and we start to look at it as, oh my gosh, you had stuff in your life that made it hard for you to feel safe. I have stuff in my life that makes it hard for me to feel safe. Your stuff triggers me. My stuff triggers you. Oh my God. Neither of us know how to find safety in relationship. Want to go figure that out together? Oh, what a relief that is to me.
Yeah. And it's so simplifying, just like Lynn Marie's pointers too, about what an awakened relating would look like, where it's like, yes, we all have complex conditioning and experiences. We absolutely all do. But if we're trying to address it from the point of view of needing to like get to the bottom of every single one of our challenging experiences, it's just exhausting, and it's not really the root structure. The root structure is understanding, like, safety is what we're after. And oh, when you don't feel safe, it looks like this. When I don't feel safe, it looks like this. And P.S., what does safety even feel like? Let's go experience what safety even feels like. And that's why having a third party person can be so helpful, because they're kind of holding the space of regulation. They're helping
and
you
transmitting safety.
Yeah, to understand what feeling safe even is. So that just makes it so much more simple than all the complexities, right? Of like, well, they have this habit and so did my dad. And so, they need to stop the habit, or I can never forgive them. Like, we can just get down to the really foundational stuff. And Lynn Marie was pointing at doing this from the place of awareness, just awareness. Like you were just pointing out, right? Oh, I've got stuff. You've got stuff. It shows up in these different ways.
We're lock and key for the stuff. And let's see if we can learn to reestablish safety. So, if the two people are really committed as individuals, they can also learn on their own self-regulation. You can listen to something like this together, so you have a new frame with which to hold the reactivities that arise. But, I just guess the reason why I'm talking about couples therapy here is because first, we've had a lot of episodes where we talk about self-regulation. It's also because I think sometimes there's stigma, and it's like, well, if you didn't grow up with the right cues of safety and you're not finding it in intimacy, geez, it's just super helpful. Don't feel stigmatized if, oh no, it's only a year in and I have to go to couples therapy. Like, so what? If you think that there's enough good in the relationship, and one thing I liked that Lynn Marie pointed to is that the relationship is evolving. Like, you say that something bothers you, and then the person actually responds, and then you guys find a new place to live, and then, like land, and then you say something else. Like, if all of that's there, so what? Should you repeat this for 10 years before you get to go to couples therapy? Like, once we understand, we can go in and get support. And I think one other thing that I want to say is, if you go to see a therapist, and this is a therapist, it's a spiritual teacher, it's a coach, I went to see a personal trainer I felt really unsafe with once, anyone, a Rolfer, anyone that you go and you feel judged, shamed, shut down, like you're spiraling, it's probably a sign that that person can't hold the transmission of safety with you. And you're best off going somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't want to put all of the blame outward, because sometimes we're so dysregulated, we never can find cues of safety, or cues of safety are like very hit or miss depending on how active our limbic system is. But I think we all know that even when we've been in those states, if there's someone who genuinely transmits, I love you no matter what, you're so welcome here, we will relax. And I know I've had otherwise very smart, insightful, helpful practitioners in my life who I walk away feeling ashamed or judged or caught in a self-critical loop, which is non-adaptive and non-growth oriented. And if I understood more about this nervous system, I would have just left.
Yeah, because you realize like no transformation is actually going to come out of this. And the truth is that, I've gone through stages of my life where it was very hard to experience, to know what safety felt like. Like I've had to reparent myself in that way. What does safety even feel like? What does regulation even feel like? And I can think back to a time where that was sort of at its height, as parenting young child, going through a divorce, got into a very messy relationship. So I was like really dysregulated. And there was a friend group that showed up, and they had tons of cues of unconditional love and safety, unconditional kind regard. And I really, even in that time, gravitated towards them just to say, like, we can be really messed up and also acknowledge that when true safety shows up in the environment, even for those of us who are pretty dysregulated in this way, we will naturally gravitate towards it. So all we're doing in many ways is trying to bring up our level of awareness on this. Like, does moving towards, in the example I just gave, the friend group and spending time with them feel like, does spending time with, the unwell partner feel like, banging metal on a metal pot? That's not what safety feels like. And so if we can bring these things up to awareness, we can just navigate our lives in ways that are way more nourishing. And we all deserve nourishing lives.
Yeah. And when you said that, I thought, so of course, if there's enough glue between you and whomever you're relating with in your life, then it's worth trying to resolve to see if we can find safety together, right? Mm-hmm. If we can establish that. But if you can't, and it's over and over again, and you never feel quite safe in that relationship, well, then that's something to really consider, right?
Whether it's a therapeutic relationship or an intimate relationship.
Whatever it is. And you look at it from the internal angle, like, is there something? But more often what I'm observing is if it's chronically unsafe with that person, or very often, it's your spidey senses telling you that there's not safety to be had here. Mm-hmm. And that if there's not safety to be had here, there's not actual intimacy and contact and connection to be had here. And if that's not the case, is this a really helpful, growthful relationship for me? Right. And then you get to decide that. Of course, if it's your family, you may decide that that's more complex. There's no simple solution. But when it comes to our partnerships and our friendships, these are things that we can look at with a little bit more ease and fluidity. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for being a part of our community and for listening to today's show. Here is a wonderful review on iTunes that we got from Pegflyfar. I discovered Bliss and Grit earlier this year, and it quickly became my favorite podcast. Finding Brooke and Vanessa has felt like coming home. To hear people talking about concepts and teachings that I only discuss with my healer and my 12-step sponsor gives me the understanding that I am not alone in this journey of transformation. I have been listening to the episodes in random order, choosing the title that speaks to me most on any given day, and every time the episode is exactly what I need to hear. Brooke and Vanessa's humor, honesty, and perspective are a bright light guiding us home to ourselves. So happy I found you. Thank you. We're so happy you found us too, and we're so grateful to all of you for listening, for the support that you send us, whether you're a patron over at Patreon or just communicating with us on Instagram or Facebook or sending us emails. It is hugely appreciated. And the show notes, I should mention, including any of the resources, because we got into a lot of resources this episode, those are always at blissandgrit.com within each episode's separate post. Thank you so much, and we'll be back next week.